was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them! Bring balance to the Force, not leave it in...
Well, Obi-Wan Kenobi was pretty mediocre. I'm not going to get into whether it's the worst major Star Wars product. Certainly it's the least of them. The least ambitious, the least interesting, the least motivated. In many respects, the least able. A couple of months ago, I decided to make a series of 3 videos thinking about what I was thinking of as turning battleships. Directors coming to established brands and trying to deliberately pivot them. The first was on The Matrix, the second was on Batman, and the last was going to be about Star Wars. About what happens when the brand fights back, grabs hold of the wheel and pulls it back the other way, and Star Wars is definitely capsizing. This is sort of that video, but I'm not sure the story is quite as cut and dry as I thought it was a few weeks ago. So let's talk about how we got here. In 2012, Disney acquired Lucasfilm and the rights to Star Wars from George Lucas for just over $4 billion, announcing their intention to, and this is a slight paraphrase, monetize the shit out of it. By the time they announced the acquisition, they already had a new trilogy of movies in the works, predicated on Lucas's old fiction, to be clear, a fiction, but one that fans have always loved to pretend was real. That he had always had a trilogy of trilogies planned, but movies take time to make. And Disney wanted, reasonably, some kind of payoff for that $4 billion investment. So the plan became to make a sequel movie every 2 years, considering that little more than let's make a trilogy had been conceived, a very accelerated pace. And in the off years, what were called anthology movies, movies that were framed as standalone, but that were actually intimately connected to the main timeline. The first would function as a prologue to the original trilogy, the second would be an origin story for Han Solo, and the third would be something about Obi-Wan Kenobi. A fourth such movie about Boba Fett, without a concrete release date, was also put into development, and this plan was received with rapturous acclaim. And then they made The Force Awakens, and it's good. I've never really understood the ambivalence people attach to The Force Awakens. I think people have trouble respecting the importance of, the necessity of, and the difficulty of good setup. While The Force Awakens has some slippery storytelling and is a more conservative movie structurally than I might like these years later, it's also transparently trying to update what that structure does and who it's for. And it's really good at telling a coherent story that itself sets up all the conflicts, themes, and stories that we're going to get to later. If you loved The Last Jedi, I'm sorry, but all the stuff in The Last Jedi that works best is set up in The Force Awakens. And if you hated The Last Jedi, I'm sorry, but all the stuff you hated in The Last Jedi is set up here. I'm constantly surprised going back to it how many touches there are, how much there is to work with, how careful the movie is to set up Rey's skills early in the movie so they work when she uses them later, how it refuses to give Luke, Han, and Leia easy happily ever afters, how legitimately hilarious the buddy angle between Finn and Poe is.
That's my jacket. Oh. No. Keep it suits you.
How the First Order is deliberately positioned as neo-Nazis as Imperial cosplayers who lack the vision and coherence of the Empire but are as dangerous specifically because they're unconstrained by reality. How Rey and Kylo are cleverly mirrored, that their key flaws are both their anger stemming from their feelings of abandonment and how they're seeking authority figures to fill that feeling of abandonment.
And Han Solo, I feel like he's the father you never had. He would have disappointed you.
And then they made the first of the anthology movies, and it's good too. Production was a bit of a mess with the original writer taking over shooting and reshoots partway through, but it's a remarkably coherent and, in fact, a beautiful movie. Shot after shot after shot, it looks the way you always wanted Star Wars to look, and it has one of the most powerful third acts I've ever seen on film. And yes, there are far too many callbacks. Much of it feels less intended to be fan service and more like an effort to take the world of Star Wars as it's been established and treat it as the world on its face. Stormtroopers, Star Destroyers, droids, old weather-beaten cargo ships, and people saying,
"Pilots, you'll be briefed by your squadron leaders en route. May the Force be with you."
But even there, it feels a little too much like an old EU product. Just throwing Y-Wings and Mon Calamari admirals and Bail Organa at you and saying, "Please cheer."
I've got a bad feeling about it. Quiet. What?
And trying to recreate Tarkin and Leia with CGI rather than recast them was a mistake with repercussions across the whole franchise, and Saw Gerrera is a pile of overdone creative choices that don't cohere, brought back because he existed in The Thing. The plot structure is confusing at best. Everyone on the team is too elite, each one able, on their own, to take down whole squads of enemies without effort, manifesting new skills easily, for us to really understand the stakes as we hit the downslope. Other characters treat Jyn as a natural commander, even though all the character work, all of it, has pointed in the opposite direction. The plot is overly convenient. It features one of the worst written Star Wars scenes outside the prequels.
The time to fight is now. Yes. Every moment you waste is another step closer to the ashes of Jeddah.
The tone is unrelentingly grim in a way that can't be reconciled with a bloodless Star Warsiness, and it's less often the tense wartime adventure that seems to have been intended, and more often just kinda dreary. But it remains the most creatively ambitious, the most thematically powerful Disney Star Wars. It wants to explore the rebellion conceptually. While it frequently exhorts that the rebellion is about hope, more precisely it says that the rebellion is about redemption, about moral growth, about choosing to be a part of something better.
You can stand to see the Imperial flag reign across the galaxy.
It's not a problem if you don't look up.
Everyone is sometimes tired and hopeless, and lets fear or frustration or exhaustion overwhelm them into doing the wrong thing, or doing nothing. So rebellion isn't about the good guys, it's about becoming the good guys, choosing to become the good guys, and therefore choosing to place your trust in others, knowing they also have been imperfect, because they also have felt hopeless and afraid, and have also done something bad once, and they also are choosing now to be a part of something good, now. By extension, it's a fundamental moral argument about what good and evil are, about what it means for the rebellion to be good. The Empire is evil because it's built on distrust and backstabbing and deceit. The rebellion is good because it is built on having faith in the goodness of others, and the willingness to sacrifice for others, knowing they would sacrifice for you.
Take it! Take it!
In the aftermath of The Last Jedi's release, the movie became the target of a persistent online hate mob. They hated everything interesting or good about it. They hated that Poe Dameron didn't magically get to run the whole resistance. They hated that Rey's parents really were just nobodies. They hated that people not named Skywalker could use the Force. They hated that Snoke turned out to be one last stopping point on Kylo Ren's journey to the dark side, one last moment for Kylo Ren to reject redemption, and not just another Palpatine, even though they'd totally just been complaining that Snoke was just another Palpatine. And yeah, they really hated that the attractive dudes they pasted their entire identities onto weren't the subjects of the movie's fawning veneration. I don't want to come down on anyone who was engaged in defending the movie from that hate mob, because A, The Last Jedi is a good movie, and B, obviously fuck those assholes, but The Last Jedi is more good than great. In terms of plot beats, in terms of character, it's a very capable sequel to The Force Awakens, developing all those pieces we talked about and doing it well. It handles Finn's abandonment issues, the hollowness of the First Order, Rey and Kylo's anger and search for mentorship, and eventual emergence out from their flawed mentor's shadows. It handles all of that naturally and cleverly, and sets up a powerful, if overprescribed, conclusion. But there's a level of self-satisfaction in it that I find grating in a movie that's not really laying much personal on the line, and it's advancing a meta-commentary about Star Wars that Star Wars was already making about itself by 2004. The Last Jedi is right that you have to burn the old Jedi texts. It's right that you have to make movies about people that aren't Skywalkers. It's right that these stories should focus less on chosen heroes and more on
Scum. Rebel scum.
But these are not original or even novel critiques. But I don't accept the idea that this story represents some wild deviation from the ordinary structures of the trilogy, because I honestly think for how proud of itself the movie is, it's too ordinary. It doesn't really live up to its own critique. It wants Star Wars to grow, but it hasn't grown that much itself, and it doesn't establish a template for a really great, really different Star Wars movie. As much as it does a good Star Wars movie while also shouting, "Grow up," which, considering the reaction people had to it, maybe not wrong, but that only counts for so much. And if they just made a conclusion to this trilogy, The Last Jedi would be a very good second act in that trilogy, though it also stumbles in the specific ways that grate on me.
You're wrong. Maybe.
In June 2017, 6 months into the filming of Solo: A Star Wars Story, 4 years after development began, directors Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were fired, and Ron Howard was brought in to direct the conclusion of filming and extensive reshoots. The disagreement seems to have stemmed from a creative conflict that grew toxic. Lord and Miller intended to shoot the movie as a straight comedy, or at least with much of the casual banter you might expect from comedy directors, encouraging improvisation by actors. On the other hand, longtime Star Wars writer Lawrence Kasdan, with Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm's blessing, had written Solo as a straightforward sci-fi adventure with some humorous touches, and they expected the movie to be filmed as written and approved. For them, bringing in the directors of 21 Jump Street to make Solo was like bringing in the director of Elf to make Iron Man, getting a director who could film comedy to make sure the jokes landed, not to make the whole movie out of improvisational humor. Although the director of Iron Man did make the whole movie out of improvisational humor, but that's not the point. Anyway, the point is the conflict ballooned out into other issues. Lucasfilm insisted on getting star Alden Ehrenreich, an acting coach, late into production, and they pressured Lord and Miller to film at the more aggressive pace Lucasfilm expected, which the directors felt denied them the time to work through the creative process, which again isn't really something Lucasfilm wanted them to be doing anyway. Eventually, Lord and Miller may have begun limiting the number of takes they shot, evidently intending to limit the opportunity Lucasfilm would have to change the movie after filming. And on the one hand, it's easy to look at certain scenes, like the name scene,
Solo.
or the scene where they meet Lando,
Everything you've heard about me is true.
and feel how much more appropriate it might have been to adopt a more lighthearted approach to the whole movie. On the other hand, is the audience really going to accept making Han Solo less a funny action hero Indiana Jones figure and more a fully comic character? A character who gets sent up explicitly in his own canonical origin story? What does that do to the beloved star of the original trilogy? On the one hand, the more comic experimental approach might well have led to a better movie. On the other hand, Lord and Miller can't possibly have been unaware that they were way off what they'd been hired for and that they risked real damage to the property they'd been hired to steward. Kennedy seems to have wished for Kasdan, also an experienced director, to take control of the project, but union rules prevented an existing member of the production from taking over direction without the existing director's consent. Eventually, Kennedy fired Lord and Miller and hired Academy Award-winning director Ron Howard to complete filming and then run extensive reshoots. The result is a movie that's, well, disposable. For all the negative attention, all the dunks, it's watchable enough. It moves with a decent tempo, its cast is charismatic, it doesn't feel like a comically bad movie. It just doesn't really feel like anything at all. Anyway, Han Solo's ex-girlfriend Kira is now one of the most important characters in the Star Wars canon.
You and I will be working much more closely from now on.
The Rise of Skywalker is a bad movie. I can tell you 2 stories about why. The first is the one I kinda want to be true, which is it's devoid of ideas, disrespectful to its characters, both patronizing to and beholden to the lowest impulses of its audience, filled with pointless and distracting concessions to the most hateful discourse, trading in cliché as though it has no idea that expressiveness or meaning or even narrative complication even exists. A movie so cynical it doesn't seem aware that anyone, anywhere has ever been authentic. And that story is, I think, true, and that's why I don't like it. But I think most people don't like it because of the second reason, which is that it's a mess. In 2017, writer-director Colin Trevorrow left Episode 9, then called Duel of the Fates, due to what were called creative differences. Those differences seem to stem from 3 things. First, Trevorrow's movie, The Book of Henry, was released to massively negative reception. Second, Trevorrow's script for the movie was, to be frank, okay, but not exactly good. Third, Trevorrow seemed unable to make changes that satisfied Lucasfilm's notes. Disney eventually lost all confidence in Trevorrow and hired J.J. Abrams to return, with a mandate to turn around an entire movie, not reshoots in a new cut, but an entirely new, mega-budget, effects-heavy blockbuster film from screenplay to post-production in 27 months. Abrams also seems to have struggled with the plot of the movie, including casting Matt Smith in a role that was never filmed, and attempting to assemble a subplot involving Leia out of unused footage of Carrie Fisher, an effort that, judging by the evidence on the screen, was not particularly successful. Getting a movie out at all under those constraints was surely a challenge, and they did barely manage. The thing they made was, unsurprisingly, unimpressive. Was it the wrong choice to fire Trevorrow and start over from scratch? Well, the simple answer is yes. The Rise of Skywalker is not an able movie on its own, and not really an able conclusion to a trilogy. While Abrams and Lucasfilm threw The Last Jedi to the wolves, trying to create a narrative that The Rise of Skywalker is a return to the plan of The Force Awakens, I don't think that narrative holds up to actually watching the movies. Not only does The Rise of Skywalker not respect The Last Jedi, it also doesn't respect Abrams' own The Force Awakens. It's a catastrophe of storytelling. Virtually every narrative element, from Kylo Ren's redemption to Emperor Palpatine's secret armada of Star Destroyers to that awful ending, is unmotivated in the series, requires you to invent an entire narrative that never happened to defend the possibility that any of this could work at all. But Trevorrow's script, if the leaked script is authentic, is unimpressive. Unlike The Rise of Skywalker, it's a workable conclusion to the trilogy. It fundamentally follows through and resolves the through lines from its predecessors. On the other hand, it lacks energy and settles on the least interesting solutions to the problems developed by the previous movies. So the more complex answer is that it's not about firing Trevorrow. Maybe he should have gone, maybe not. But you have to be willing to accept sometimes that the thing is not ready, fundamentally not working, and press pause, nail down what you want, get the executives on board, work it through, and get it right. But even if they'd done that, even if it wasn't a wreck, the decision to indulge the most hateful, toxic parts of the discourse, to build their entire PR strategy around this manufactured and obvious lie for the benefit of misogynistic, racist, reactionary fans whose only influence has been making people's lives miserable, I would not forgive that. Partly because it ruined the trilogy, partly because of its consequences for the performers, because, well, here's some of the people in The Last Jedi whose careers have flourished since leaving Star Wars, and here are some of the ones that Lucasfilm self-consciously, deliberately abandoned to the assholes and whose careers were slowed or stalled by it. But also partly because inviting that entitlement into the brand, giving it A veto over the product killed the human spark in Star Wars, left it a zombie, just kind of shambling along. A Star Wars zombie. You know, like the reanimated Geonosian warriors created by Queen Karina the Great to stop Buzz and Luminara Unduli from finding Archduke Poggle the Lesser. Totally a thing. So they stopped making movies. I guess they thought they were just slowing down for a bit, but Rian Johnson was supposed to get a trilogy of movies, and then those movies just stopped being made. Dan Weiss and David Benioff were given a whole trilogy, and then those were cancelled. Knights of the Old Republic movie was in the works, then disappeared. Kevin Feige was working on a movie, and it's both in and not in development. Patty Jenkins was making a Rogue Squadron movie, and then it was delayed, and then she put her other projects on hold to focus on it, and then it disappeared. Right now, Taika Waititi is supposed to have a movie coming out in late 2023, and he's been answering a ton of questions in the press about it, but it's late 2022 and he hasn't gotten approval for a script draft yet. If any movie project has gotten past script treatments before quietly disappearing or just getting cancelled, they're keeping it a very good secret. Either way, let's be clear what happened. The Force Awakens, Rogue One, and The Last Jedi aren't just the most critically liked of the Disney Star Wars era, or the ones I like most. They're also the biggest box office successes, and they're the only Star Wars movies to earn A CinemaScore ratings, which means they're the only 3 movies since the original trilogy that audiences left the theaters almost unanimously recommending to others. They fucking nailed it. And then they wildly overcorrected based on a tiny but extremely vocal group of terminally online assholes who matter more because they organize targeted harassment campaigns than they ever have at the box office. And now they've spent 3 years trying to play it off with a casual lean and a stupid grin, saying, "I meant to do that." There it is. The era of Disney Plus. For Marvel, these shows have been minor supporting texts, discourse drivers that feed the superfans that in turn act as a vanguard of hype that drives those massive box office openings. But for Star Wars, the Disney Plus shows are it. The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Obi-Wan Kenobi are the top-level experience. The most significant creative output that is being put out with the Star Wars label. And I'm sorry, it's kinda shit. The structural issues are of a unit, and they are mostly familiar issues, so I want to talk about them together. But since they're not equivalently bad, quickly, let's get that out of the way. Jon Favreau does for the first season of The Mandalorian what he did for Iron Man. Boil things down to the core resonant idea, identify the kind of storytelling that's best suited to it, hit the right story beats in the right way. Even if he doesn't exactly hit Iron Man's heights, the first season mostly retells stock Western plots in the Star Wars universe, and it feels good, even if the season never adds up to anything more than a basic dad story. It's not a very high bar, but it definitely clears it. The second season is mostly pilots for other shows, CGI Luke Skywalker, being told to care about an especially lighty-sabery lightsaber, and Giancarlo Esposito at his most stunt-casty.
Just know that Far Cry is known for its larger-than-life villains.
Okay, almost his most stunt-casty. The Book of Boba Fett is The Mandalorian 2.5. That's not my analysis, that's literally what the production team called it on set. It may once have had the potential to be something like Star Wars High Plains Drifter, or some kind of ultra-dark deconstructionist revisionist thing about these violent people whose action figures you love, and it just fell victim to too many principles, too many people protecting too many views of the brand, and the plot and presentation got softened and softened and softened until there was no meaning left at all. I don't know, that's just a guess. Halfway through the Book of Boba Fett, it stops being its own thing and just goes and does The Mandalorian again. Then it brings back CGI Luke Skywalker, awkwardly avoiding close-ups and using tricks of focus and distance to conceal the fact that CGI Luke just doesn't look great. But that pivot is a huge red flag. Suddenly doing this halfway through destroys the flow of the show, and it would be easy to distribute the same scenes across episodes in a way that makes it clear structurally that we're headed for a climactic team-up. These kinds of obvious fixes leave you wondering why experienced filmmakers aren't taking them, and we're going to come back to that. But first, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't really anything at all. The Mandalorian has its powerful dad story and its space western vibes. The Book of Boba Fett is trying to be something, even if I'm not sure what that is, and I'm quite sure it fails. But Obi-Wan Kenobi is a void of storytelling. There are no themes, emotional stakes, physical stakes, character growth, or even any basically usable character conflict. And this isn't even criticism insofar as it's so lacking in the mechanics of storytelling that it feels immunized against criticism on that basis. Am I supposed to discuss the portrayal of Obi-Wan? Whether Reva was written well? Whether it was worth it to bring back Darth Vader? Why would I bother? It's so void of any of the basic things stories are for, that the only way I can substantively discuss it is couching it in this weird structural examination of the last decade of Star Wars. You know how a brown dwarf is like a star, looks sort of like a star, is about the same size as a star, but just doesn't do anything stars do? That's Obi-Wan Kenobi. It has just enough of the ephemera of storytelling that it can introduce a few new characters that might one day get their own brown dwarf sub-story objects. Alright, let's talk about the volume. The volume is synecdoche for a set of tools called stagecraft, built around the volume stage, which is being used to create the Star Wars shows and a small but increasing number of other shows and movies. It's like a conventional stage in which the backdrop is a set of enormous curved LED screens displaying a rendered backdrop. In a certain sense, this reverses the CGI process from how it works on green screen sets. Instead of actors doing movements and then a scene being built around them, the backdrop is built on the computer, projected around the actors, and the actors perform inside the scene. The reason it works better than old rear projection technology is, well, for one thing, the image projection is just a lot better, but second, the image projected on the screens isn't fully pre-recorded, but can be relit to match the set, and renders and shifts in real time based on the motion of the camera. The upsides are substantial. The lighting often feels more natural than green screen shots. The use of real sets makes it possible to use more props and decor, and it provides a space for the actors to act in. But the physical sets, at least as built so far, are not huge, and the size of the screens and the computational power of the renderers limits how far out the camera can be pulled. And since they're screens, pushing the camera in creates pixelation and moire effects. If either the camera or the actors move vertically or toward or away from the screen, there's a risk of exposing the edges of the screens or the seams between them. The LED screens are light emitting, which often creates a more natural look but can also be limiting. And of course they are just backdrops. Any CG element in the foreground or interacting with the cast still has to be put in later. All told, the volume appears to produce the most believable images when ultra-high-grade 3D scans of real, natural environments are lightly modified with CGI. Fully computer-animated backdrops tend to look uncanny. So, while the volume is powerful, there are real limits to what it can do without heavy preparation and customization. Less authentic and more restrictive than genuine location shooting, less usable and interactable than modern green screen or practical effects. What the volume is a lot cheaper and a lot faster. You can shoot your urban chase scene without locking down a city location for days or weeks of shooting, or having to use a take where things didn't go right because you couldn't. You can shoot your desert planet story without sending your entire production to film on location in a desert, waiting every single day for the sun to be in the right location to maintain continuity. You can send your second unit team out there, get your 3D scans, and then just do everything on sets where you can get the lighting and the sound right over and over again. There are physical limitations to what the volume is suited for, but it's clearly a useful tool. But Being able to work fast and cheap doesn't mean your storytelling can get away with being fast and cheap. You still have to break the stories and work through the scripts. You could take the extra time to do that work. So if you're watching a 6 or 8 episode miniseries that was produced entirely in advance of release and you're going, it feels like they're backpedaling in the last episode from where they were before, or it feels like they're just redoing the same plot beats over and over again, that's a huge red flag, because it suggests they haven't done that work even when every opportunity to do it does exist. Because if you're a franchise that's gotten in the habit of letting stories that don't really have buy-in, or aren't really going well, progress and progress and progress until the last moment it's physically possible to reposition, then firing people and bringing in new people to try to salvage it, that's now operating on a mandate of having 20 plus individual hours of content a year to pour down the content pipes, you can not. You can wander along, let things get written and cast and even filmed before yet another person with veto power comes along and makes you start over again until there's no time left for things to get vetoed anymore, and then take your show from concept to film with whatever concept you happen to have when it's too late to change anything. If you're watching Obi-Wan Kenobi and you're going, why does Leia keep getting recaptured and freed over and over again? Or, why did nothing that happened in this episode actually matter to the show? Or, why is the only storytelling that matters to anything in the whole show being done in the final episode immediately before it's summarily stepped on like it's a joke? Yes, these are problems with the show, but I also think they're evidence of broken processes. Letting obsession with protecting the brand drive everything to a halt and then making mediocre to bad milquetoast offerings to meet rapidly onrushing deadlines. In my initial outline of the script, this part was titled Second Acts Forever. Not just that the meta-narrative goes on forever, but that the individual products never even pay off. Certainly there's a way that's true of Obi-Wan Kenobi, how Deborah Chow in fact characterized the show as inserting a second act into the story of Obi-Wan and Anakin, a claim that even I, the world's biggest fan of 3-act structure, think is ultimately just nonsense. That is to some degree how they're framing it, how Kathleen Kennedy frames it when she says, it's one story that we carry forward, a persistent story that goes on, one big pile of narrative, never set up except that the characters previously appeared in something else, never paid off except that the show runs out of episodes, talking points and references but no beginnings or endings. Like a WWE storyline, the characters cut a few promos, they fight a few times, the energy sort of peters out, and the characters get split up to fight some other characters. And there's a degree by which that's true. The inability to deliver effective payoffs is already having lasting consequences. But there's a difference between the low ambitions of MCU shows like Hawkeye, the limited creative successes of MCU shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the total collapse of narrative energy that Star Wars is falling into. The place where the people in charge of Star Wars will genuinely act like having a cute Yoda is a bold and revolutionary creative idea. I think it's probably overstating things to say that Lucasfilm intends to create products as devoid of consequence, memorability, and power as Obi-Wan Kenobi turned out to be. It's probably more accurate to say that they don't mind enough to fix it. The brand, as it runs now, isn't just producing inferior stories, it's a response to an obvious misreading of the response to their best products. It's overseen the decline of the brand from a mass cultural phenomenon to a substantially more niche, toxic nerd product. And it's inefficient. But, at least for now, they are satisfying the corporate objectives. So, look, this isn't a breakup letter. Star Wars has made itself both embarrassing and dull. Dull because this is what they're making. Embarrassing because being into it means being associated with the hate mob Lucasfilm deliberately indulged, but also embarrassing because Obi-Wan Kenobi was not worth my time more or less on purpose. Because they don't respect me and that makes me feel humiliated. I'm sure they'll make good shows and good movies again. By accident, if nothing else. The setting has a ton of potential, and their past reputation attracts talent today like their FC Barcelona. Will it be Andor or Ahsoka or The Acolyte? maybe. At some point, one has to say not, I quit, but right now you aren't earning my time. If people I trust recommend one of those next few shows, say, Sam, you're going to be into this one, or even, Sam, you're going to have a lot of thoughts on this one, I'm going to watch it, and probably have a lot of thoughts on it. But there's so much great art, great shows, great movies that are worth my time. So I'll be back when Star Wars respects me again.